I just wanted to get started right away and say, good morning to our guests in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon if you're joining us from somewhere in the world, and good evening to folks from India. This is, of course, is the fifth edition of the USISPF Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues, and the first one for the new year. Of course, we had a very, very busy new year, and what we're trying to do right now with the new series is getting a eclectic panel with think tankers, journalists, academics, former government officials, now in the private sector, like people like Anthony, to discuss all things Indo-Pacific, and as we started the new year with a bang, President Trump got sworn in for the second time, unprecedented, only happened once before with Grover Cleveland, and of course, a flurry of world leaders have kind of made quick trips to Washington to engage with President Trump. Of course, Prime Minister Modi being one of the more recent leaders, having to come to Washington just from Paris, a quick pit stop, just under 30 hours, but short visit, but still substantial nonetheless. And we saw key announcements from defense to trade to energy, to counter-terrorism, technology, and strengthening, of course, the larger soft power, which is the people-to-people relations. And we're still writing our analysis. Questions are still swirling. We're trying to decipher the joint statement. And to help put all of that into perspective, I am delighted to be joined by this really stellar panel. And I don't say that lightly because these are people who have either worked in policy and government, who have seen U.S.-India relations in various contours, and and obviously are obviously helpful to add the method and the madness whenever we see some policy documents come out and try to decipher it. And I'm going to introduce them, but Dr. Tanvi Madan, senior fellow at Brookings, Dr. Aparna Pande, research fellow at Hudson Institute, Anthony Renzulli, associate partner at DGA Albright Stonebridge Group, but had many hats in government. And we should be joined by Pramit Pal Chaudhuri very, very soon. Apologies, he's stuck in Delhi traffic, but he assures us he'll join us. And when he does, we'll get started. And of course, their bios are very extensive, but for brevity of time, I wanted to just introduce them, even though they don't need any introduction to all of you who know their work. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas here at USISPF, and these conversations are being recorded. And we'll try to get through as many of your audience questions, but I'll kick the ball rolling. And, with you, Tanvi. Tanvi, of course, there's a lot of talk that's happened on the broader Indo-Pacific region. And of course, it's a term that got more or less codified in Trump 1.0. And it's one area that President Trump, since the time he occupied the Oval, has sort of spoken about. So we sort of see this strategic continuity, a new 10-year framework on the major defense partnership. And one of the deals signed was the U.S. India Compact, another acronym to add to the U.S. India lexicon. And this sort of follows on what we saw SOSA, the security of supply arrangement, when Defense Minister Rajnath Singh visited in the Washington summer. So where does this add right now, the Compact chapter, to the larger U.S. India defense framework, Tanvi?
Thanks, Akshobh. It's great to be with all of you and with Aparna, Anthony, and Pramit. I want to step back just in terms of setting the stage for this visit. I think when you ask about the Indo-Pacific, part of the where it plays in is the idea of a shared vision of the Indo-Pacific, shared concerns about China even, have provided kind of been a key driver of the US-India relationship across multiple administrations now. It's not the only reason for the relationship moving forward. There are economic, technological, people-to-people reasons, cooperation on the multilateral and regional stages. But I think this idea of the shared vision has really been driving this relationship. It's also particularly crucial in terms of where both India and the US have been in the moment in terms of competing with China. And so I think this laid the groundwork for why you saw a prime minister in an unprecedented way, an Indian prime minister, come this early into an administration. Part of the reason being understanding the importance of the US, not just as a external balancer in the Indo-Pacific, a country that helps ensure that China is deterred, helps ensure a shared vision of that region or a favorable balance of power, but that it is also the U.S. has become crucial to India's ability to provide alternatives in the region and to strengthen India's own capabilities. So I think the Indo-Pacific in one way played into this trip in terms of why you saw this trip happening in the first place as it did. But I think there were two kind of broader purposes as I saw it for the Indian Prime Minister coming. The way I've described it is one part of it was brush clearing. The second was a hope to tone an agenda set. And in some ways, especially on that latter part, I think that's where you see the Indo-Pacific featuring in the continuities that India has been hoping for. I think the brush clearing part, though, is important. This idea that you really needed to clear some things, that some issues, or at least anticipate some asks from President Trump, that if you left too long, you were going to have a flare up. And also, it helps clear the ground for that forward movement that you might want. And so I think you saw, and we'll talk about this more, but on trade, on immigration, on some other economic issues, some movements on energy, etc. Both kind of anticipating some asks, but also putting things on the table. I think this is then lays the ground for that other, the rest of what you talk about on the Indo-Pacific. And there were several good signs there in terms of the continuities, I think, in the joint statement, talking about, India as an important partner, talking about some specific collaboration, even talking about further operational collaboration, including through the Quad, and highlighting some of the security dimensions of that. We'll talk about, I think, more the technology aspects, which have been a crucial part of this relationship. So I think you saw a lot there. I would say that how far India and the US go on these two in the Trump administration, which has a very different approach, I think, even from definitely from President Biden in some ways and emphases, but I would say even from Trump 1.0. So as important as the continuities are, I don't want us to lose the fact that there are some two elements of change that are worth watching. If you read the joint statement, it is very clear that there's homework for both sides in terms of very specific deliverables on some deals and an economic agreement down the line. And there's a date, fall 2025, when President Trump is expected to go to India. To me, the ability to move forward on the Indo-Pacific cooperation will depend on the ability to deliver on those questions. Because if you listen to President Trump himself, and you can talk about everybody else in the administration, if you listen to President Trump himself, the issues he is focused on are those issues of trade, of deals, etc. And the second thing I would watch, and I would say that Indo-Pacific cooperation, the extent of it, will be determined by, is where the administration comes down on China. And I hear a lot of people talking about that as if it's a given, as if the kind of competing with China aspect will continue. I think this is a space to watch because I think you hear from the president himself sometimes two competing instincts. One to compete, the other to strike a deal. Now, it's entirely possible he'll strike a deal like last time and China won't deliver and we'll go back to competing. But I would just say watch that space because if a China is going to give something, they're going to ask for something in return. And that question is, what do they ask? Including, are they going to ask for a spheres of influence world where they get to determine things in Asia? So I'd watch that space.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tanvi. And of course, you watch the space carefully on the China part, given from your great book, Fateful Triangle. I've been touching on the China aspect, given the elephant in the room that we've seen is always the dragon. And yeah, of course, it was a very, the time of Prime Minister Modi's visit suddenly fructified out of thin air. He flew into the Washington cold and, but of course, left a warmer relationship. And Anthony, I want to get to you at this point. This would, going down memory lanes, evoke some memories of the Monumental State visit when you were in government. Of course, not as epochal as that, given this was a working level visit. But you were part of the brain trust that helped implement some of the key initiatives that now we use in common Washington lexicon, from ISET, the Indus X under ISET, the jet engines deal, MQ-9 drones. Far from the pomp and show of the state visit, this report card would still read a lot of policy outcomes. So how would you rate the report card of this joint statement coming out? And particularly given that Indus innovation that we have seen, that innovation bridge right now mirroring the Indus X platform is a new thing that we saw in the joint statement. And that will sort of strengthen the defense and tech ties between private sector, VCs, and government bodies altogether.
Hi, Akshobh. Thanks for the invitation to join my friends on this panel and the audience to talk a little bit about U.S. India relations. I give it a high mark. It was a very substantive agenda, as Tanvi laid out. Clearly, a lot to be implemented still. I don't think we would necessarily we didn't see deliverables per se, as they are sometimes defined, or outcomes, but a lot to work on. Certainly a lot of continuity, and if imitation is the highest form of flattery, then I think folks who worked in the Biden White House are flattered, but they did, of course, repackage. So as you mentioned, new acronyms in the India lexicon. That's not altogether unusual, by the way. I've been around long enough to have seen many mechanisms that sort of in acronyms that fall into the rear view. But really, the agenda was highly continuous with what Biden had been doing, along with some realignment around Trump priorities, which was to be expected. And we can talk a little bit further about trade and how they're going to go about that. But otherwise, clean energy sort of fell off, but nuclear was elevated. Hydrocarbons were elevated. Again, nothing particularly substantive in what they're going to do, but they made certain commitments about targets they wish to achieve. And so I thought that was quite good. It was all there, basically. Almost the full agenda. Health kind of fell off, which that was always an important bilateral element. And there's no saying that it won't continue. The cooperation that the U.S. and India have long enjoyed in that space, well before the advent of sort of the modern strategic partnership. Development, cooperation, those sorts of things naturally sort of drifted down, but they had never really been high priorities anyway. I mean, the real question for me moving forward is, how do you implement? I mean, Tanvi first raised the concern about China. I think that is a wild card. We'll have to see. But I retain that the U.S.-India partnership has its own momentum beyond convergence between the United States and India around China. And I think that is still the case, although China had been, of course, an important animating factor. And if the U.S. were to find a new approach or set a new floor, so to speak, under the relationship with China, then that could create some challenges. If I were India, I'd certainly be looking around and continuing to try to diversify, my partnerships in the world. Trade, of course, challenging. If reducing the trade deficit is the sum of success on the trade front, then I think there's going to be a lot of challenges. But elevating a trade agenda within the strategic partnership is probably a good move. And I would argue, something maybe the Biden administration hadn't spent enough time on, sort of integrating strategic trade with more traditional commercial trade and investment. The two things are more linked than many would believe. The ability of U.S. companies, for example, to invest in India is impacted by invest in the strategic technology and electronics and other semiconductors, et cetera, is impacted substantially by the investment climate in India, issues around licensing, export controls, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a good thing. But again, if we're reducing this strictly to the trade deficit, then that's going to be a challenge. India's success, if it can get its growth rate higher, is likely to lead to a higher deficit than lower. But we'll see. And then I was pleased to see that on immigration, they acknowledged the importance of mobility and even endorsed the sort of legal, safe, secure mobility frameworks, which suggests that maybe we won't have a drop-off on student visas right away, and that India or the U.S. administration will at least respect the dignity of Indian nationals as they move forward on repatriations, which is an agenda they needed to move forward on. So lots of good outcomes and continuity there. And I think there's the Biden administration reframed the agenda around technology. I think that seems to still be central to it. And defense industrial cooperation and other things don't seem to have been lost. But nevertheless, this focus on trade and reducing the trade deficit, and with tariffs sort of noisily being articulated in the background, does suggest, that the Indians will have to lean forward a little bit on defense sales, which they seem to have done quite a bit in this joint statement, and what I gather during the discussion between the president and prime minister and their teams. Good on the U.S. for leaning a little bit harder on India. There's probably an element of reciprocity that could have always been, let's say, the partnership may have benefited from a stronger element of that all along. So I credit them for trying to bring that in, but implementing needs a strong bureaucracy on both sides, and that's another factor that I think that needs to be watched. I mean, the extent to which the U.S. can carry this forward right now, as the NSC is still building its own team and the interagency needs to come to strength. This is not an optimal moment for the State Department, for example. And so there's a lot of rebuilding, and it's going to be difficult to rebuild the bureaucracy at a time when it looks like the Trump administration is, taking a machete to it.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Yeah, it certainly seems machete in terms of certain things on immigration and particularly on trade. There's so much to talk about. I think we can just have an hour just discussing Trump and trade. And just as we do that, I'm sure as we talk about tariffs, I think Pramit's beaten Delhi traffic. So Pramit, welcome. Thank you so much. It's great to have you on board. And just in the nick of time, just we're coming to you next. So it's great to see you here, Pramit. Pramit, obviously you're in New Delhi, so that's the vantage point you're going to give us today. Given that, when we spoke about Prime Minister Modi's last two visits, of course, there was a state visit in 2023, then the 2024 visit when he came to Delaware for the Quad Leader Summit. And those, of course, were very successful with the Biden administration. I just wanted to kind of speak about this visit. There was some perception that the sheen had been lost a little bit given the footage of immigrants being deported, and there was some chatter back in Delhi as to how this would kind of play with the multitude back in India, and of course tariffs will continues to be a key element of Trump's foreign policy from Trump 1.0 to Trump 2.0. And before the visit there was this concern that Trump, having called India a tariff king in the past, may sort of bring that up. So from your vantage point in Delhi, how is the visit being seen, perhaps pre-visit and now post-visit? What's the sort of assessment?
So I think at the official level, they were anyway bracing for the fact that this Trump would, as one official told me, be the real Trump as opposed to Trump 1.0, which was mitigated both by Trump's inexperience as a president and the fact that he had to induct a large number of, should we say, mainstream Washington bureaucrats and officials. This is the real thing, if you wish. And it was known to the Indian side, I think anybody who had been monitoring him, that he had been very frustrated that his broad sort of isolationist positions on both the America's global economic situation and alliance requirements would be genuinely exposed, or would become a genuine policy. But the mitigation, so the question is, what do you mitigate it now with? What do you keep? What do you blunt Trump's basically likely unilateral demands, both on trade and on various other issues such as migration? And I think for the Indian side, I think the key was, one, that we're not a very big trade surplus with the United States. We have a trade surplus in services, but for some reason, Trump is not particularly concerned about that. Second, Trump seems to place India there's a cluster of countries which he places either because they are just huge, they're very big, and they have strong men that he admires or thinks have a certain status that he deals with. And I would say that he sees China, Russia, India, maybe Saudi Arabia in that group. And so that means that he thinks he needs to strike deals with these countries, and he puts them in a separate category from even Western allies and so on. And you can see that in the inauguration, but also events that took place after the inauguration, which were more private with the MAGA and who he had decided to invite among foreign leaders or foreign representatives. So that was the mitigating. That was basically how you had to play it. India had other smaller cards. There are more Trump towers, either existing or being built in India than any other country in the world. That always helps with him. So you had all of this. Trump has always been effectively in private. He'll bully you because his art of the deal is all about trying to get leverage, and he thinks that's the way to do it. So threats are part of his game. So he will threaten you with tariffs, he'll threaten you with other things and make complaints about your government. That was expected. I think that's expected by every government that has dealt with him. The game then is to then have him then move to the next stage, which is where you give him a package. And I think for the Indians, the game was that the package should be reasonably small, but what you really want to do is fold in most of the big issues into a negotiating structure. rather than have to sit down and do it right in a summit in which you just basically put stuff together and potentially have Trump, given how mercurial he is, suddenly go awry and denounce you or complain bitterly at the press conference, or as he did with once, I think the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull slammed the phone down and say, "This is the worst phone call I've ever had with a world leader." So that's what you're trying to avoid. And I think that was done. You folded most of the big issues into a trade, something that is being called a free trade agreement, though it may not be a genuine treaty structure as we would be normally expect an FTA to be with. We have, as Anthony's mentioned, some military purchases. That was, some of them were anyway, like the Stryker, and even the P3I were already on the table, if you wish, and are very close to completion. But Trump, as I've said, what's interesting about Trump, all the threats he's made about tariffs to countries across the world. I mean, he's not actually been very harsh on India, I would say. He's actually not applied any of them yet, right? We assume the universal tariffs that he imposes, India cannot avoid. But remember, that happened in Trump 1.0 as well. We got stuck with steel and aluminium tariffs. It did not make a major dent in the Indian system. If you were to put a tariff on pharmaceutical products, exports, he would drive up medical prices in the United States. 50% of America's generic medicines come from India, so I'm not too sure that would be sensible for him to do. So my guess is, and if you've already done a couple of studies, Citibank, Standard Chartered have already sat down and said, okay, let's assume a minimum 10% tariff in various sectors in the Indian economy. In the worst case scenario, you're seeing Indian exports drop, global exports drop by about 12%, knocking off maybe 0.5% of GDP growth. Nobody expects Trump to go down that path. I think we'll see potentially he'll use the threat of tariffs, and maybe the Indian side is braced for the possible use of one or two tariffs on, as he said, reciprocal areas. As a negotiating ploy. You know, you have your first phase is supposed to be completed by September. We presume there'll be other phases. And in some cases, I think India will accept reciprocal tariffs. They say, okay, if you want to hit us with reciprocal tariffs in agricultural products, go ahead. India does not concede agriculture to anybody, dairy products. But India doesn't export agricultural products of any consequence to the United States, right? There's a little bit of wheat and a little bit of rice and a few other things, but nothing really very important to the Indian economy. It's going to be the other things, the machinery, the electronics. The fastest growing Indian export to the United States is Apple iPhones. In other words, it's an American product going back to the United States. If you were to tariff it, frankly, given the size of a company like Apple, they would know very well how to do tariff jumping, which is you just move the supply chains here and there, and you go through a third country, and you basically are not really affected. That tends to happen with big multinationals. And the gems and jewelry part, which probably India can concede because America is not competitive in the export of gems and jewelry. So I could see a bunch of tariff concessions coming in pretty easy. The real issue and the most difficult one is not tariffs, it's not military supplies, it's what in trade terms is called national treatment. That is what was basically the table thumping sessions behind closed doors, is you have to stop, India must stop discriminating against US technology firms operating in India. If they are in e-commerce, whether they are cross-border data flow, data privacy, data storage, a whole bunch of technology areas, and go on and on. The Indian practice of tilting the regulatory environment against those companies, foreign companies, and the promotion of national champions, that is unacceptable. But that is not something I don't think Modi will concede with ease. So that is, I think, the core. I don't see that being part of the first phase. I hope it's not, but it will be a big chunk of whatever follows.
No, thanks for that, Pramit, especially on the US tech firms in India, because normally the conversation's always been about Indian tech firms in the US vis-a-vis the H-1B issue as well. And we'll definitely touch on the Javelin and the Strikers and more on that a little bit. But Aparna, I want to get to you next. I mean, apart from US-India relations, you've studied this region well. The subcontinent is one of your forte, especially with regional security and counterterrorism. One of the things that I think most of us did not see coming, I think Tanvi did, was of course the extradition that was announced of Taur Rana, one of the accused of 2611 terror attacks, and accomplice of David Coleman Headley, a Pakistani American who's still in custody in the United States. While the US and India signed an extradition treaty, I think in 1997, I think back when Ambassador Sandhu was still first secretary at the embassy, India sort of still had this struggle of trying to get accused back, particularly from hostile lands. But where did this come from? Like, what sort of was in your assessment, the political will and appetite for something like this, which is very significant, especially back home in Delhi, for this kind of move to kind of fructify in the policy space?
Thanks, Akshobh. Great to be on a panel with Tanvi, Anthony, and Pramit. Actually, this was predictable, and this has been happening for some years now. It's not new. The extradition request was actually granted, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in April 21. And for the next 2 years, Mr. Rana has been fighting it. And in July 23, again, the Biden administration, the DOJ actually urged courts to deny his appeal where he didn't want to be extradited. And so the January 25 was simply a 4-year culmination of what was to happen. So this is something which is old. It just happened in January 25 and basically 2 weeks before the Prime Minister came. But it didn't have anything to do with the Trump administration or with the upcoming summit. It had to do with something which was in the works for a long time. But, this trace, I mean, there's a big picture element to this. I mean, India-US, I would say counterterrorism cooperation dates back to 9/11, I would say. It's from 9/11. It's one of the building blocks from around that time, which built this, the strategic partnership. One element was counterterrorism. A key part was the US administration, from the Indian point of view, finally, recognizing and actually coming on India's side of the ledger when it came to terrorism. And especially when it came to applying pressure on Pakistan, whether it's post 9/11, whether it's post 2008 Mumbai attacks. And so there are two people India has wanted for a long time, both Headley and Rana. Headley actually pleaded guilty and signed an agreement that he would not be extradited back to India. And so he cannot be extradited as of now. Rana was not part of the Headley agreement. Rana did not plead guilty. He did not cooperate. And therefore, for a long time, the US government has been on board with extraditing him. The American judicial system just took a long period of time, and his appeal went right up to the Supreme Court. That's why. But at the end of the day, I would say this is again something which has happened across administrations, something which has happened, a culmination of about 20 odd years of US-India cooperation in this sphere. But yes, it does send a message at a time when the Indian Prime Minister was here. It also sends a message indirectly, to Pakistan. And I think for that, India would be very in the Indian government would be pleased that it's sending a message that yes, even if it takes 2 decades, for 13, 14 years, India finally managed to extradite somebody who was responsible for one of the most heinous terrorist attacks which took place in the country. Thanks.
No, thanks for that, Aparna. And of course, that's another marker where US-Pakistan relations in the last decade and a half since 2011 Abbottabad have sort of just completely fallen by the wayside. Tanvi, just getting back to you, Pramit, of course, touched on some of the defense deals. Of course, that was a very heavy part of the joint statement. We've read about Javelin, Strikers, P-8s, Chinooks, Apaches, howitzers, a lot to list out there. There was some mentions even in the press reports about F-35s at some point. I just wanted to ask you, given, we've seen that a lot of the priority right now in Washington, New Delhi is to expand defense sales, talk about strengthening New Delhi's, interoperability and defense industrial cooperation. Where does this sort of lie right now in the way the Washington sees New Delhi's historic relationship with Moscow, given also Trump 1.0 did impose CAATSA, and of course that hung on like a sword of Damocles given the S-400 procurement. And one of the things we've seen, and Pramit also touched on, is a sense of Trump transactionalism. So does the think tank within the Trump administration sort of understands India's strategic autonomy a little more, or where would that sort of lie in Trump's calculus?
I think this is one of the places that I was mentioning, that we are seeing continuities, but there's also changes that we have to grapple with that are different in our Trump 2.0. And I think this is what Pramit was alluding to too, that this is not going to be business. It's not going to be business as usual, even when it comes to comparing Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0. And I mentioned this because I think this is where the Russia aspect comes in. We've seen just in the last few days that you might see a very different approach to Russia than President Trump was able to take in the first term. At that point, whether congressional reasons, others, Russia, for instance, also continuing to interfere in elections, other things that made it hard for people to make the case about a rapprochement of sort or another reset. You did see that ability, there was a lot of hope, I remember in 2017, that, uncertainty be at Trump, but one thing that might be good is that he would take a very different approach to Russia, and that would take the Russia pressure off. But you saw CAATSA actually being passed during the last Trump administration. That didn't happen. Now you see again this idea that there might be, there's talk of a high-level U.S.-Russia summit. At the moment, an end to a Russia-Ukraine war that would seem to lean very much towards Russia's position. India has wanted to see an end to the war. So I think that, and part of the reason India has wanted to see an end to the war isn't just the second and third order effects that have affected India directly in terms of the economy and others, but also because you've seen a couple of things. One, sanctions that have affected India. And second, this concern that Russia was becoming increasingly dependent on and closer to China. And this put paid to this Indian idea, and for a while it was also a French and Japanese idea, that the US should, in the West writ large, should actually reset relations with Russia so that it wouldn't, so to prevent it from getting closer to China, which for India is a strategic nightmare. And I think depending on where this conversation between, so this is not about India, US, but I think a lot of this question that you asked is how will this play will in part depend on, and I think in large part depend on where this conversation on the US-Russia relationship will go. Because, if there is talk of removing sanctions, of actually, a very different US-Russia relationship, that Congress, including Republicans who had previously been critical of that kind of approach, if they kind of support that, you could see an India that would actually not be one of the countries in the world that's not entirely displeased by that idea. I think the problem for India is the other part that President Trump has talked about, which is a kind of US, Russia, China summit of sorts. Because if this leads to that sphere of influence, kind of a Yalta 2.0, then the fact that India is not at that table has certain complications, because then that sphere of influence means Russia, you deal with Europe, China, you deal with Asia. That has different connotations. So I think we're gonna wait to see, we have to wait to see how this plays out. I think it brings a broader point, which has been alluded to by almost everybody, which is, I think in some ways the strict bilateral issues are manageable between India and the US. But there are these other debates that are going to play out within the administration, either on China, on Russia, on Iran, also on the functional issues, immigration, trade, industrial policy, which will also play out in terms of your point on co-production, and also various aspects of technology policy. These debates, we don't know where they're going to go. They're factions within the Trump administration. And the result of those debates will actually, I think, be more consequential for the US-India relationship, because I think the two sides will be able to manage. And I think Russia is one of those issues where it's not an India-US issue. It has impacts on it. But I think this will be determined by what happens between the US and Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yalta 2.0 is a great analogy, Tanvi. And given that President Trump did want to see an end to what he calls the calamity in Ukraine and wants a quick fix solution, of course, that's not gone down well with Zelensky and many others. And on the technology transfer bit, Anthony, I want to come to you next because you've spoken about Strategic Trade Authorization 1, STA 1 in 2018, which you mentioned was one of the most seminal parts of the US India defense cooperation. That was shortly after India was designated the major defense partner in 2016. And if I'm not mistaken, India was only the third Asian country after Japan and South Korea to get STA1, both treaty allies. And given that that's also we've seen in the joint statement, the US India Trust, another acronym that we all now have to learn. Where do you see the current discourse right now between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi on accelerating that defense tech cooperation, especially now as we spoke about domains like space and air defense, which are so integral to ISAT and INDUSEX, and things that now you work on very closely in the private sector?
Thanks, Akshobh. I mean, coming back to STA1, I just, I don't claim to be a deep expert in it in terms of what the actual results were. I think one would have to study it further in terms of Indian trade, and but obviously its ability to access this type of technology license-free was extremely critical, and I think it built a higher level of trust between the two countries, and the first Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for that. What I've made is the observation that the two sides were somewhat able to compartmentalize issues. So, as you know, Pramit mentioned, steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed against India. They were ultimately reduced by the Biden administration subsequently, but and GSP was rescinded, GSP market access. At the same time, STA1 trade authorization was granted to India. And I think that's a reflection of some deft diplomacy on the Indian side. And again, the ability to compartmentalize irritants shows a certain maturity. Now, whether the future Trump administration is going to be, caught flat-footed in the same way, I don't know. I suspect it looks like they're going to be integrating these challenges. And if you look at the joint statement alone, they're treating these issues more holistically. I think that's a good opportunity for India and for US-India ties. But my sense is, I was sort of out of India at the time, but my sense is that those two things were happening on sort of different tracks, the sort of USTR-led trade track and the discussions that may have been happening with the White House and the Commerce Department and the other agencies responsible for STA1. Nevertheless, political leadership is important, and those decisions were made by the last administration. I mean, going forward, I think with defense, as in other areas, it really comes down to what your goals are. If it's diversifying supply chains and building more resilient supply chains and elevating India's role as a contributor to stronger supply chains, more diversified supply chains, then this is I think they're off to a good start. But if the goal is to reduce the U.S. Trade deficit with India, I'm not clear exactly how you can hold these two thoughts at once. And again, Pramit talked about fair treatment for U.S. companies operating in India. There's a wide range of challenges that they have. If those challenges are dealt with, I expect that you will see more U.S. investment gravitate toward India, and you'll see more exports from India of technology that is likely to boost trade, but more favorably on the Indian side, perhaps, at least if you compute it in terms of the impact on the trade deficit. The U.S. is obviously continuing to absorb a lot of capital. The dollar is very strong, and the trade deficit is a certain reality. So if you see that trade deficit continue to swell, I think tariff pressures will rise, and you could see challenges there. Similarly on defense. Defense sales versus defense industrial cooperation are they're sort of two sides of perhaps of the same coin, but they're not exactly the same thing. And I think they sort of fudged it in talking about defense procurements. And the last White House, it looks like the current White House is picking this up, tried to sort of have it, I wouldn't say both ways, but building out sort of procurements up front, and then as you gravitate toward more technology transfer and more make in India defense industrial, production in India going forward. That's the model of Stryker. I believe that's the model of Javelin. It's essentially what was articulated in the GE engine deal as well, which is still to be finalized between the two entities. So I do think you can square that circle. technology transfer will be a really important aspect of any decisions I'm sure India will make in the future to purchase more U.S. defense hardware. So these are good opportunities for India. I think there are deals around trade and technology transfer and defense sales and defense co-production for the co-development. But again, I think you need to be clear about what your goals are. It looks like a trusted technology partnership and strategic defense technology partnership is what the administration wants, but there are competing pressures there. So I'm watching those a little bit. I know that companies are looking out for those as well. The tariff threats are unsettling to private companies that are considering investing in India or expanding investments in India, as well as in Mexico and other places. They just are. India has never been explicitly exempted. In fact, President Trump said no exceptions or no exemptions. So we'll have to see how they play out. It looks like they have at least bought time until the fall as they discuss this so-called bilateral trade agreement. And so we'll watch it. But broadly speaking on defense, we talk about continuity. Looks like the world is falling apart and every maxim of U.S. foreign policy is blowing up, but U.S.-India relations remain on a continuous trajectory. I hope those can be protected or, safeguarded against, trends that may be happening all around the region and the world. But, that's something that I think India watchers are going to be paying close attention to.
Well, the phenomenal thing about a panel like this is you lead into my next questions, each of you, because you've just so much to unpack there. And I do see audience questions coming in. I do want to get to that. But on the trade part, Pramit, just going straight to you next. I mean, one of the key things coming about, and we speak about this here at USISPF is also like US-India bilateral trade, somewhere hovering near 200 billion. There's a talk about trying to make it 500 billion. Some people have even spoken about a future of $1 trillion of trade between US and India at some point in the future. And that was one of the things that came out, the bilateral trade agreement by fall 2025, as Anthony mentions, called Mission 500. And one of the things coming out from that is President Trump speaks about, and the plan of Mission 500 is to reduce trade barriers, making it easier for businesses. But also on the same day, President Trump also signed the presidential memorandum of reciprocal trade and tariffs, which touches on trade imbalances and unfair trade practices. And while it doesn't impose tariffs just yet, is there sort of this juxtaposition between what came out in the policy statement and what we saw at 1 p.m. Washington time, or is that just par for the course?
See, there's a lot of contradictions in what Trump says and what he does. And it's not easy to work out, definitely for other governments. I think even for the US government at times, from what I've heard, when some of his cabinet ministers, when briefing foreign governments, have sort of had to waffle because they're not clear what the president wants to do. So, for example, he is very clear in his America First strategy. He wants manufacturing to be moved to America. I had kind of assumed, therefore, that many of the supply chain integration agreements that Anthony and others in the Biden administration had negotiated were therefore in danger, because a lot of those would basically mean America would support manufacturing in the United States, in India. And what we saw at the press conference and in the press statement that was issued, that a lot of what the Biden administration had negotiated on semiconductors, on pharmaceuticals, for example, on fentanyl production and so on, were retained. And in fact, they added more things like, autonomous systems and so on. The only thing the Trump administration seemed to be interested in was rebranding it so the names used by the Biden administration were not retained, which was an easy give for India to concede. We saw Elon Musk and Trump hold a joint, I guess you call it a press conference, and Musk says in front of Trump, "I'm going to be manufacturing Teslas in India." Trump grumbles about this. He says, "Not a great idea. I don't like it." He doesn't stop Musk. He doesn't say, "No, I'm not going to allow that. That undermines my entire America First policy." So you go through these and you keep wondering, I was expecting Trump to say, "No, I'm not going to support manufacturing." But the press statement says, "We will expand the industrial capacities of both countries through these policies," which is exactly what's going to happen. So where exactly does Trump have a red line about America supporting manufacturing in India? Is not very clear. I couldn't tell at the end of this. I said, oh, well, actually, this would have been more or less what I would have expected in a Biden or a Harris Modi summit meeting in terms of these things. So nothing much there. Or what will happen. But it's perfectly possible Trump may change his mind later, and this is what hopefully the negotiations will handle or slowly set down. Trump was, I gather, famous in his first term for not reading files and not really worrying about micro details of what was happening. So a lot of his staff could therefore could ease a lot of these issues through. If we buy major American defense platforms, uh, India will not back down on offsets or that a lot of this has to be manufactured of parts and components. And therefore, they're not going to give an American exemption for fear that other governments will demand the same thing. Um, so it may be possible that they will announce a purchase. What normally you do, you buy a first batch straight from the government involved. Trump can declare victory. After that, everything subsequently is basically becomes a B2B deal where both sides, the companies work it out with who their partners are going to be in India. And most of the American defense companies talked to who are involved in these deals assume that that's going to be how it's going to work out. There's simply no way, they say, we can see the Indian government saying we will do a complete FMS in which we just pay and get nothing out of this for Indian defense manufacturing. So how does this play out is not clear. I would say that India is less baffled than many other governments are. If you talk to the Taiwanese or the Nordic countries, they're almost catatonic trying to figure out because a lot of what this is contradictory. Trump has other game. I mean, there are other elements to the relationship which didn't come out, but which I gather were discussed, which was, for example, Trump's violent opposition to the BRICS currency. Who is his strongest ally than that in the BRICS? It's India. India is dead opposed to a combined BRICS currency because they fear that would mean it will be a Chinese-dominated currency. The use of local currencies for trade is not really a major issue for India. India does almost all of its trade in dollars and euros, except for a little bit with Russia. That's fine. I don't think that that is an issue. And in fact, as I said, you notice it didn't pop up at all in the meetings or in the public statements, simply because the Americans realize that if there is any country that would support them within the BRICS, it would be India, because they would see that as a positive for China. On the migration thing, which I think we forgot to mention. So I think what's interesting there, yes, it was pretty much recognized after a while. I mean, Trump released a video of these shackled migrants being boarded onto the aircraft, despite India's request that type of stuff not be done. So what has India done on two things, I would say. One, you'll notice that at the summit, at the press conference, Modi spins this and he says illegal migrants are basically young poor people being cheated by traffickers. So we are going to stop this. These guys are being taken for a ride. It's nothing more than essentially a form of con men, confidence tricksers. We're going to stop that. And there has been already a crackdown in India on such things. And the government media in India has been spinning this and saying it's completely true. These are poor people being cheated. We need to stop this. This is not what was interesting in the joint statement or the press statement was that they got Trump or the Trump administration to say that legal migration was mutually beneficiary to both countries. And that's fine. India said if we can at least maintain the legal migration routes that we have right now and potentially expand them at some later point, that's enough. So the combination of those two, you basically resolve it. And then finally, there's been an agreement, you may have seen this, Costa Rica has announced that it will take the illegal migrants, Indian migrants from the United States. And I'm presuming that that means that they will be flown. It's obviously a shorter flight to Costa Rica. And it's also a country where there's no Indian media presence whatsoever. And then India will take over and fly them in commercial aircraft to India, where it will simply not be a problem as far as the public is concerned here. So I expect that migration issue to be slowly just disappear over time, at least in the public eye.
Yeah, no, that's definitely immigration and trade were two of the more contentious issues coming into this. And, Aparna, that segues to you for the trade aspect. Speaking of Spin Machine, one of the clever speech writing was we saw, Prime Minister Modi spoke about MAGA and he spoke about MEGA, that's Make India Great Again, or Viksit Bharat. And he says MAGA and MEGA makes MEGA. I mean, apart from witty speech writing and something that the Indian press corps went crazy on, there's sort of this thing of MAGA bringing back the halcyon days of American manufacturing, and where Detroit was really the economic engine of manufacturing in some ways for automobiles, bringing that back. How do you see the juxtaposition between that manufacturing in America versus with Make in India and the PLI schemes and a self-reliant India? Are these two sort of at loggerheads, or is there room to maneuver both?
Thanks, Akshobh. Actually, a lot has already been said on trade by everybody on the panel, so I'll actually stick to maybe 3 points. One, slight difference with I don't see it as Yalta as much as I see it as Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It's a spheres of influence pact between two sides who don't trust each other, and sooner or later, one or the other, if the agreement is actually signed and a pact is signed, one or the other will break it. So I don't see it lasting if it actually happens, and I see it more on those lines. That's the historical analogy I would use instead of Yalta. Second, and this is something which the panel has discussed, to answer your question, we'd have to actually discuss and debate, and I don't think we'll have an answer, which of the various factions within the Trump ecosystem are going to be dominant on which aspect. So, we have the isolationists who will always be there and always have been there, both in the Trump ecosystem and the broader American ecosystem. Monroe Doctrine, Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal, Fortress America, that perspective has been there and still remains. And then there are the primacists, basically those since the end of Second World War who say that the US needs to be the preeminent hegemon in this region and prevent any peer competitor from rising. So don't allow the Soviet Union, don't allow Russia, don't allow China. And then there are those who fall in between, who would be called the prioritizers, that, what is the key threat facing US right now? And let's focus on that. Is that domestic? Is that rebuilding American manufacturing? Is that ensuring all American companies come back and manufacture in the US? And no friendshoring or onshoring even, basically back in the United States. So not in Canada, not in Mexico, but in the US. So one could see part of that at the press conference with Elon Musk and President Trump, where Musk announced that he is going to invest. And the president at that time said he doesn't like that idea of companies manufacturing outside of the US. Now, whether or not anything happens on that is a different point, but that ideological tension comes out there. And so if there's not going to be friendshoring is something India has benefited from, because it ties into the other aspect, which is a China +1 strategy, which for the last decade or so, the US government and many American partners and allies, it's not just American companies, it is Japanese, Taiwanese, Korean, European companies which have come to India and asked their companies to maybe see India as the alternative. And if the US is withdrawing from Europe and the US would like its companies to come back, or you are not sure whether the US government wants you to come back, then you are not going to be increasing investment in countries till you are a little more reassured of where the US administration is falling on this front. So whether it is no friendshoring, whether it is do not manufacture outside the US, whether it is treat VAT the same as tariff and therefore impose reciprocal tariffs on any country which have VAT, or GST like India does, whether it is threatening sanctions on BRICS, all of those will remain like Damocles swords right up there, because one doesn't know if they'll fall or if they won't fall. And so sort of it's difficult to give an answer to that. India's challenge will be some part of what Pramit mentioned earlier. The regulatory state will need to back off and will need to make it easier for market access. Otherwise, sort of companies, which want to enter the Indian market, which want to produce in India and actually help both themselves as well as Indian exports, need some incentive from the Indian side. And India has an opportunity. Whether it does move forward on that, I think we will all wait and see. Thanks.
No, thanks for that, Aparna. Interesting analogy there. And I wanted to just get to one or two audience questions because Ken Moriyasu, a friend of the show, was on the first episode and with Nikkei, has a very interesting question. He said President Trump wants the U.S. to be a top supplier of oil and gas to India. Is U.S. a reliable supplier of energy considering how Trump has used its leverage on Canada, for instance? Should India deepen energy cooperation anyway, given the geopolitical benefits? So, interesting question on the energy partnership, given we didn't see anything particularly on climate, but of course, energy trade remains a top thing. So, it's not addressed to anyone, but I want to open this up. Anthony, Tanvi, Aparna, Pramit, whoever wants to chime in.
I mean, I don't think India would see this as much of a problem. I mean, if you go back and look at the statistics during the first Trump term, India increased its supplies of oil and gas. I think if I'm remembering correctly, the U.S. is still the second largest source of imported natural gas for India, the fourth or fifth largest source of oil. India needs oil and gas. The U.S. is a supplier. The big question is, are we going to see the kind of production increases? I mean, for India, even if those production increases come on and it doesn't go to India, it's good because, it stabilizes prices somewhat. I think the big question is the price issue. And, some of that will be related also to, then you get into the question about sanctions and other issues and, what the second, third order effects of those on prices will be. So I think there's price sensitivity, but I actually don't think there's going to be a problem. And on the nuclear side, you might not hear clean energy, but you are hearing renewable energy. And this is, again, one of those areas where I think the American private sector will continue to be wanting to engage in this domain. I mean, we might need to wait and watch and see what happens to things like Development Finance Corporation financing for big solar projects, et cetera, in India. But that's one of those big things is an American company. And so I think I actually don't think this is going to be as problematic in terms of kind of the U.S. using it. The thing about oil and gas is, if anything, in the Canadian case, they are the exporter. In India's case, they are going to be the buyer. So I think slightly different. I will just make a broader point about some of these issues about kind of buying and selling versus, kind of the production. I think one of the things, and this is again where we've seen the president himself has competing instincts. You've heard him say on things like shipbuilding, where he actually thinks some of allies should be doing this. So I think there's a way to do part of it purchase, whether on the energy side, on the defense side, and part of it talking about the co-production. But I think it'll have to be twinned. And I can totally see India making that argument that, if you come and produce here, your companies will be able to sell not just here, but make that export. I think this is where it comes down to something that everybody has pointed out, including Aparna just now, which is there are things that India needs to do for itself, not because Trump is telling them to attract more investment. There's a window of opportunity strategically in the world. And India needs it. But I think there's another aspect to this as well, which is that there is now in the next 14 months, only one state election in India. And so there's a political window of opportunity. In India, this is not a bureaucratic-ish call, as Anthony was saying on the US side. Whether or not we move forward, this is a political decision. It's a political economy decision. It has to do with that conversation between Indian business and government. But that is a call only India can make. And I think most of us who are on the panel would like India to make that. But obviously there are other stakeholders in India who might actually argue that, Trump is is now talking about national champions. So this is not the time for India to stop protecting its national champions.
Yeah, no, that's a interesting part there right now, Tanvi. And I wanted to ask you, or ask the panel rather, the second question I think that's come in on, I think you touched on a little bit more, just a CATSA question on S-400. Vikramajan, former USISPF defense lead in India, asked that US refused F-35 sales to Turkey because Turkey bought S-400 and imposed CATSA on Turkey, of course, Turkey being part of NATO and an ally. How F-35 is now an offer to India, despite the fact India has S-400. So what's changed in the past 6, 7 years for the US to offer this sale?
I'm going to jump in on that.
Mhm.
On the F-35, I think this remains to be seen. Maybe others have deeper insights than I, but what the US has agreed to do is review the policy on F-35 sales. And so it's really too early. I mean, in fact, the technology around advanced fighter jets. So it's really too early to determine what's going to be made available, whether India really wants them, whether India really needs them. Lots of discussions are going to unfurl. The company that sells those F-35s, I think, was probably taken as by surprise by the language in the joint statement as just about anybody. So we'll have to see on that. But certainly, I would have to guess that the security of US technology would be paramount if the F-35 were to be sold in the future to India, or in some measure co-produced, or at least with some offsets in India. I mean, that's what we were able to do with India on the S-400. In the end, a formal waiver was never issued, but the US DoD and the Department of State and the White House were confident that US technology security could be upheld, even with the S-400 in operation in India. And we received certain quiet assurances about that. And I think India was forthcoming. And so we've got a good result in that area. With Turkey, of course, as you mentioned, it's a NATO ally, an integrated defense structure. So that was much, much harder to do. Although I don't know, maybe the Trump administration will look at the F-35 in Turkey, again in the future. So that's ultimately what it comes down to. And just to rewind a little bit on defense, you asked earlier whether or not there's a wiggle room, and I think the wiggle room ultimately comes around technology. I think India will buy and be willing to buy more stuff, and offsets are in part of it. But the MQ-9B, for example, sale was not heavily laden with offsets. It was effectively a defense sale, but the hard work had been done to make under the reclassification of UAVs in the MTCR and to include India in that. Also something that happened in the first Trump administration. And so you had the ability, India's ability to access a very advanced technology. Some signals have been pointed to the undersea domain. I don't know what those, I have some ideas about what those are. We can perhaps talk offline, but that's going to be the hard work of ensuring the integrity and the security of US defense technology if it were to be deployed by India in the field, and how you share the intelligence, for example, that may be developed through the deployment of this technology. And here I think it comes back to the bureaucratic question. You do need good people in the agencies who are responsible, who know these issues, to do this work. It can't be, I would retain, decreed by the National Security Advisor. That was true under the Biden administration as well, where you had a very NSC-centric approach, but often a lot of hard work to get actual things done. And some of those things that I think Biden administration should be proud of didn't get done until the very, very end around, for example, civil space launch technology, and some work on that made possible, I think, progress on the civil nuclear deal that perhaps the Trump administration will take, for example, removing several Indian nuclear entities from the Commerce Department entity list. Those things happened really late because they're kind of hard to do. This administration can cut through the bureaucracy, which I think is a good thing, and probably with some precision. But you do ultimately need that bureaucracy to uphold, to ensure that your interests are protected and preserved as you go forward. And then just really quick on CATSA, Rubio had introduced as a senator a bill that was essentially going to give India a permanent CATSA waiver for legacy defense technology. Technology that Russian technology was already deploying. I think in light of sort of shifting sands on US-Russia, CATSA is likely to become less of an issue going forward, although it could be a point of leverage should India announce a a major new and major or significant, rather, how you define those has always been a little loose under the bill. New defense acquisition from Russia, but to my knowledge, none are in the, let's call it, near-term pipeline right now.
Well, thanks for that, Anthony. And of course, well, we could be all day here talking, but I'm also cognizant of the time that we've
Sorry.
gone overboard. And thank you to all four of you for such a riveting session. And I don't want to keep, Tanvi, Aparna, and Anthony from busy day in Washington, and Pramit from your evening in New Delhi. But thank you so much. And this has been our 5th episode. We'll definitely have a lot more as as policy outcomes start to unfurl, and to have you guys on for another episode. And so thank you all so much. And these conversation is being recorded, so it'll be available later on our YouTube channel for you to revisit and quote their insights. So thank you, sir, guys, all so much, and thank you for everyone joining. Thank you for your questions, and until next time, bye bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Akshobh.